They tore it along the seam first, where the straps meet the body, where a thing holds where it resists. Fingers hooked like claws, laughter curling off their tongues, they yanked until the fabric sighed. Then came the hard, impatient rip that feels like someone pulling the breath from your throat. Books spilled the way guts do when a story gets ugly. Notebooks flapped open like panicked wings. The zipper teeth clacked against the linoleum in a silver scatter, and his pens rolled, blue, red, black, smooth and dumb down the slope of the hallway he had learned to avoid at certain hours. He stooped, choking on humiliation he refused to name, and gathered what he could in two hands that were shaking with the effort not to crack. The bullies walked away as if they were finished with a chore. On the bus ride home, he pressed his cheek against the cool window and counted each breath to keep from crying. He thought about his mother's careful money, scraped together for a backpack she'd said would last, stitched strong at the points that mattered. He thought about the way the teacher had watched it happen and hadn't seen, how some adults are expertly blind when the spectacle doesn't involve them. He thought about the word they had started using recently, too dark, and how it had begun to stalk him through the day like a dog off its leash. He thought about the stubborn fact that he still had homework to do, a life to carry, somehow, without a bag. Years later, people would hold his product in their hands and marvel at its weight, the way it balanced on the body like a promise kept. They'd run their fingers along its stitching and not know to call that seam defiance. They'd whisper about the value of the brand, the investors who had elbowed in to be part of it, the way millions had become a word said casually around his name, as if this had been inevitable. He would smile the way you learn to smile when you've done something that still makes your hands shake a little with gratitude. Then he would go back to work, because the work was never the money. It was the answer, to the rip, to the word, to the world. He grew up on a street where the morning began with buses hissing like dragons and ended with streetlights clicking on one by one, a string of small moons leading you home. The apartment building stood tired but upright, its skin patched with paint the color of restraint. Inside, the hallways smelled like dinners from a dozen countries, and the carpet welcomed your footsteps like an old aunt who pretends she isn't listening to your business. The unit his family rented had 2 bedrooms and a living room that turned into a third on nights when company stayed late. The kitchen was his mother's cathedral, a space so small the refrigerator door brushed the stove when you opened it, a window that showed only another wall, a counter where magic happened anyway. His mother cooked what her mother had taught her to cook, and what poverty had taught her to improvise. She could stretch a chicken across 3 days like a prayer. She had a way with spices, small brown kingdoms in repurposed jars that could turn a Tuesday into a memory. On Sundays she fried dough, dusted it with sugar that fell like quiet snow, and told stories as if they were part of the recipe. He learned to stand at the stove and stir without splashing, to taste and wait and then taste again. He learned that patience is a flavor. They had moved to this country 1 suitcase at a time, 1 phone call at a time, 1 paper signed in a fluorescent room at a time. His parents carried in their mouths the shape of their first language and worked around it in the world like a pebble beneath the tongue. In the neighborhood, the word immigrant was a mirror held up in different light. Some used it as a slur, others wore it like a badge. His family treated it as a fact. We came, we learn, we build. They believed in work as if it were a sacrament, something that makes you holy not by being seen doing it, but by doing it right when no one is clapping. School was theater with high stakes. Rules braided themselves around him like vines. Don't run. Don't talk. Use inside voice. He learned early that there are different versions of don't, depending on your skin. His white friend interrupted a teacher with a joke and everyone laughed. He did the same and the room went cold. It took him another year to understand that the room didn't hate him. It had simply been taught to fear his volume. He turned the dial down. He looked for other ways to be heard. In the cafeteria, he learned the choreography of seating that no adult had written, but every kid had memorized. Who sits where? Who gets saved a spot? Who carries home lunch in Tupperware that smells like cumin and earns eye rolls and pinched noses? He spotted the kids who ate quickly, heads down, as if speed could make shame easier to digest. He learned the currency of trades, a cookie for chips, a seat for a bite of something warm. He learned that hunger is not only a body's complaint, it's a mind's. After school, he took the bus to a job sweeping floors in a corner store that sold exactly what people needed: milk, cigarettes, diapers at markups no one liked but everyone tolerated, cheap umbrellas that surrendered during the first rain. Between mopping and making change, he studied how things are made and priced and placed. He watched customers pick one brand over another simply because the shade of blue on the packaging reminded them of home. He learned that function matters first, but presentation is the usher that leads it onto the stage. He watched his mother repair his backpack with needle and thread, pushing the point through fabric dense enough to resist a lesser woman. She hummed while she worked, a tune that sounded like the engine of the old window fan. "You can always fix it," she said quietly, not looking up. He knew she meant more than canvas and strap. He knew because he had been there the night his father came home, with his body tied in knots of frustration. And she had untied them with a bowl of stew and a hand on his shoulder. The next morning, the man had gone out again into a world that mispronounced his name and his worth, and had returned, once more, in one piece. He was 14 and had grown too fast, all limbs and angles and neck, when the incident that would haunt his hands happened. The hallway between last period and the bus felt like an open field where predators hunt in the tall grass. He had learned to move through it by keeping his head down, by making himself a small, busy thing that did not invite attention. But attention is a jealous god. It comes even when you avert your eyes. They saw him, a cluster of older boys who had claimed this stretch of linoleum as theirs, and they saw his backpack, a navy bag with a stitched-on patch his mother had found at a church rummage sale, a patch of a rocket ship blasting through a cartoon cloud. They sneered and said the word again, too dark. The way they said it wasn't about him at all. It was about owning the scene. The ripping begins as a demonstration. It always does. One hand, two hands, a third for show. It's a ritual designed to test the edges of punishment, to test whether any adult in earshot will graduate from "boys, that's enough" to "stop." No one did. And once the seam gives, because seams always do when stressed correctly, the rest is a descent. Books sprawled, notebooks vomiting notes and doodles and half-written poems. A comic he had hidden between classes slid across the floor and stopped against an east-facing locker like a beached fish. His free hand swung out, reflex, and caught only air. The strap went last, and with its death, a part of his day-to-day went with it. The simple machine he carried, all the things he needed to be a student inside. He gathered his books into a hug and felt the flush crawl from throat to scalp. Someone stepped on his paper. Someone else whistled as if this were entertainment. The boys walked away not because they had mercy, but because they were bored. He stood there with his life in his arms and discovered a new weight. The knowledge that some things aren't replaced by apologies and new purchases. Some things rip through to something else. Something that lurks in a boy and waits for a chance to tell him a new truth about himself. That he is not enough. That he doesn't belong. That he would be easier to love if he were different. He did not cry in school. He took the bus home and cried into his pillow in small, muffled bursts that shook his shoulders, but not his voice. His mother came in quietly and sat on the bed with the heaviness of a woman who has lived through 100 moments like this, in 100 versions. "Tell me," she said, and he did in a tide of words that drowned the room. She listened to the end and then did something he did not expect. She took a deep breath, wiped his cheeks with the rough pad of her thumb, and asked, "If you could make a backpack that no one could rip, how would you make it?" He stared at her as if she had asked him to lift the house. Then he looked down at his hands and started to answer. "Straps that run down to the bottom and up again," he said slowly, drawing an imaginary line with his finger in the air. "Reinforced at the corners, maybe." And here he reached for the torn patch and traced the outline where cloth had failed. Another layer inside, like armor. They walked to the kitchen table together, pushed aside the salt and pepper, and spread out the patient-injured bag. She got her sewing kit the way a surgeon reaches for instruments. He got the cheap tape measure they kept in the drawer and a notebook. She stitched while he sketched, a back and forth of hands that made a new thing in the air between them. By the time the first stars landed outside on the black window, he had a drawing he could not stop looking at. It looked like a promise. It looked like a blueprint for a life where his things could be kept safe because he had learned how to keep them. The next weeks were a glossary of humiliation and repair. He learned to carry his books with a rubber band around them, to tuck pencils behind his ear. He learned to avoid the center of hallway, to pivot and hug walls, to make corner turns into art. But he also learned where to buy canvas cheap, where to find straps they used on luggage at the thrift shop, where an old man on the second floor would let him use a heavy needle he had for leather. He made his first bag on that kitchen table, stitches crooked in places, corners proud of themselves, straps stitched down like an argument you win by refusing to get tired. He did not set out to build a brand. He set out to build a bag that could survive his life. Resistance looked at first like a child wearing a thing he had made himself. He walked back into school with the bag on his back and braced for ridicule. It came, of course, like a summer storm that passes through at 3 p.m. every day, whether you are ready or not. But something else came too, curiosity. A boy from his algebra class asked if he could see the inside. Another asked where he had bought it. He said he'd made it. Heads turned. Jokes paused. Someone said, "Can you make me one?" He shrugged because he had learned by now that hope draws predators. "Maybe," he said. He started making after school 2 a week, then 3. He charged enough to buy more material, and to cover the hole in the grocery budget he saw his mother pretending not to worry about. He learned to price his time and not apologize for it. He learned to say no to the kid who wanted a bag for free because it was just sewing. He learned that design is not only about strength. It is about listening to the way people carry their lives. One girl needed a side pocket for her inhaler. A boy wanted a hidden zipper, for reasons, he said with a grin that had more to it than any bag could fix. He added a loop at the top because a teacher had said quietly, after class, when no one was looking, that hooks in classrooms vary by an inch and the loop must be forgiving. His mother watched him work with arms folded and a small, private pride that he pretended not to see, for fear that seeing it would split him open with gratitude. She corrected his stitch when his attention wandered. She told him to stand up and stretch when he had been hunched too long over his patient cloth. He found a rhythm, schoolwork building. On weekends, he took a small table to the farmer's market and set his bags in a neat row. He sold 2 the first Saturday. The third week, he sold 5. He learned to talk about his work without flinching, to say what made it different and why that difference mattered. Racism did not stop. It changed outfits. A teacher asked if the money was going to the right place at home. Voice dipped in suspicion, implying that black and brown households cannot be trusted with profit. A parent at the market told him, with that strained cheerfulness some white people adopt when they are close to what scares them, that he was so articulate. A police officer asked him, on his way to a sale, whether the bag he carried was stolen, and then asked him to empty it onto the sidewalk. He learned again the choreography of compliance that keeps your bones unbroken. That night he added a stitch to the strap. It crossed itself like a small X, and he told himself it was for luck. Although no stitch protects a body from being mistaken for a threat, he graduated high school with hands that were already grown, hands that knew how to make a thing and persuade people to pay for it. College was a dream that had to be measured against rent. He took community college classes and kept sewing. He moved from the kitchen table to a rented corner in a shared maker's space that smelled like sawdust and ambition. He learned to cut patterns in multiples. He learned that too much growth at once is like too much spice in a stew. It looks impressive in the pot and turns in your stomach all day. He stopped taking custom orders and focused on one design, then 2. He learned the bald pain of telling someone not yet, and the joy of telling someone now. He sold online. He learned to photograph his bags in light that told the truth. He learned to write copy without lying. He learned to answer emails within 24 hours, because delay is a crack in which doubt grows. He learned to say we before he had earned the word, because I makes people imagine fragility and frazzle. We lets them imagine a team, structures, resilience. He learned most painfully to hire, to give away work he could do himself to people who could do it better in the long run. He hired an older woman with hands steadier than his for finishing. He hired a young guy who could pack and ship faster than anyone he'd ever seen. He hired a college student to answer customer service with patience he admired. When he tried to rent a small storefront, a landlord smiled in his face and told him the unit had just been leased, a fact that turned out to be a lie when 2 weeks later, he saw a new for lease sign in the same window. He returned and asked again. The landlord said something about fit, words about the neighborhood's direction, words that have always meant, not you. He brought his mother with him the next time, and his mom brought their pastor, and the pastor brought his title, and the landlord blinked at the sudden uptick in respectability. He signed a lease, but the rate was a penalty, a tax on audacity. He paid it and looked around the raw room and imagined a row of bags like a battalion waiting for deployment. The turning point began with a video. A high school class posted a clip on social media of their backpack test. Kids hanging on the straps of one of his bags like it was a jungle gym. The straps held. The class cheered. The video traveled the way wildfire does in a dry season. Orders poured in. First a trickle, then a flood that forced him to sit down and put his head in his hands because joy and panic share a doorway. He put up a banner that said, "We're working as fast as we can," and worked faster than that. A local journalist came by the store with a photographer and an open notebook. They asked for the origin story, and he gave it to them without flinching. The rip, the seam, the hallway, the word. He did not make anyone look worse than they were, or himself better than he was. He said what his mother had asked him that night, and how it had lit a wick in him. He said he wanted kids to wear his bags and feel, in that hidden inner layer, something that says you can carry it. The piece ran with a photo of him standing in a rain of straps held up like medals, and people stopped him on the street to say they had read it. "I'm buying one for my niece," a woman said. Hand pressed briefly to his arm the way strangers touch when they have decided to love you for a moment. The second moment came when a guidance counselor called to ask if he could speak to students. He did not feel like a speaker. He felt like a man trying to stay ahead of shipping deadlines. He went anyway because something in him recognized the boy sitting in the second row on the left, looking like he had no oxygen under the ridiculousness of the school's fluorescent lights. He brought a bag and turned it inside out and showed them the seam, the cross-stitch, the way reinforcement lives quietly beneath style. He told them about design and decision, about how a choice you make alone at a kitchen table can argue with a whole world that insists you shrink. When he finished, the boy in the second row on the left lifted his head and looked at him full on, and something passed between them. Not recognition, exactly, but permission. Then came the call from a national retailer, a buyer with a voice like a gleam. The buyer said words like placement and volume and rates, and those words had gravity. They could pull him into orbit or into the ground. He asked for time. He called a lawyer whose card he had been too shy to use. He read the contract out loud to the man who used to let him borrow the leather needle. He brought the paper to his mother and watched the way her mouth pursed when she read something that felt around for your pockets. He signed, but he changed the clauses that would have erased his voice. He kept his name, his colors, his mission stitched into the lining of the deal. The first month of retail was chaos that smelled like big boxes and warehouses. His team doubled. They learned to sleep in shifts. They learned to say no to the siren call of the next thing. Duffels, wallets, luggage, until the first thing had a spine strong enough to carry siblings. He turned down offers from investors who wanted to optimize operations in ways that would have wrung the dignity out of his product. He took money from a woman who sat in his store and touched the bags like they were animals that needed gentleness, and said, "I'll make my money back in 10 years as long as you keep this exactly what it is." He cried after she left because he had not realized how dangerous it is to be. Seen shares of the company changed hands for figures that made him dizzy. He hired someone to read him his bank balance like a bedtime story, until the numbers stopped being frightening and started being tools. He sent a check to the school district that had made that ridiculous alternate lunch policy and told them the money was for the kids and that he would not attend any ceremony. He met with a city council member about a small grant for a maker's space that would have been a miracle for him at 16. He funded it without a fuss. The brand grew the way a family grows. Chaos, joy, arguments about direction, a deepening of roots. He opened a second store and then a third. He moved production to a facility with windows that faced east so the first light could bless the day. But he kept the stitching stations along one long table, because that is where stories travel best. He paid well and on time. He put up a board where workers could write what they needed and what they loved in chalk that smudged. He added a daycare space in a corner that had once been dead and watched. Productivity and laughter rise in equal measure. He built an apprenticeship for teenagers who were good with their hands and bad with sitting still the way he had been. He watched a girl who could not get through algebra without bursting into tears, learn to measure a seam allowance to the millimeter, and felt the kind of pride that makes you sit down. He watched a boy who had been suspended for insubordination adjust a machine's tension with such finesse, he was almost music. He hired both of them. He launched a line that celebrated the foods kids once got teased for. With subtle designs, spirals inspired by steam, colors pulled from spices, a stitched proverb in a language the market had made some children hide. He sent the first run to schools with a note that said, "These belong here." He added a lifetime warranty to every bag because the whole point was that no kid should have to calculate whether they could afford to be rough with their life. He sat on a panel about entrepreneurship and listened as a man with a haircut that cost as much as a month's groceries told the audience, "That hustle matters more than anything. That hard work always wins." He tried not to laugh out loud. He waited his turn and said the part that gets you invited back less often, that sometimes hard work is not enough, that sometimes a door is closed not because you are weak, but because someone else is scared, that money follows whiteness the way plants follow the sun, that you will have to invent new windows. The moderator grimaced. The audience leaned forward. The brand was featured in glossy magazines. The brand was knocked off by companies who could make it cheaper and uglier and ship it faster. He fought the ones worth fighting and let the others live as a reminder that success is a kind of theft you survive by continuing to be original. He continued to design and to show up at the store and at the facility and at the schools, because a founder becomes rumor if he disappears. He had no interest in becoming legend. Legend can't fix a crooked stitch. He visited his old school. The hallway looked smaller, the lockers shorter. The light somehow had softened. He stood in the center and felt his chest flutter the way it had years ago. Custodian pushed a cart past and said, without stopping, "You did good." He smiled at the man's back and whispered, "We did." His mother's hands got stiff. He adjusted his days so he could sit with her in the afternoons and stitch alongside her, slowly, the way you do when the work is less about product and more about praise. She wore the first bag he had made on a hook in the kitchen, a relic and a reminder, the rocket ship patch like a small private joke between them. Sometimes she would reach out and touch it the way people touch the shoulder of someone they love, when they want to draw courage through their fingers. The lesson in his life isn't that pain produces profit. Pain produces pain. The lesson is that someone in a kitchen can take the ugliest moment in a child's day and ask a better question. The lesson is that too dark was a lie the world told itself, so it wouldn't have to change the lighting. The lesson is that seams can be made stronger if you are willing to stitch them twice, and that people can be made stronger if you are willing to see the rips when they appear and not pretend. The cloth holds by faith alone. If you teach, watch the hallway the way you watch the test. If you lead, interrogate your rules until they confess who they were written to exclude. If you invest, measure return not only in cash but in the ease with which a child takes a seat at lunch and opens a bag without bracing for ridicule. If you design, remember that the person you are making for is not a consumer. They are a life in motion, with elbows and dreams and a spine that deserves to straighten. And if you are the kid who has lived through anything like that, Rip, if you've scooped your day off a floor and forced your breath to behave, know this: you are not the tear. You are the hand that learns how to sew. You are the mind that learns how to ask the question that turns humiliation into blueprint. You are the person who walks back through the same hallway one day with a bag on your back that no one can rip because it was made by someone who refused to believe they were easy to tear. They tore his backpack. He built something that can't be torn so easily. Not just fabric and strap, but a room where work dignifies hands and a table where children eat without fear and a brand that turned millions into a measurement for how far a life can travel when it refuses to stop at the word. Never. The zipper teeth line up. The seam holds. The bag hangs from his shoulder, a quiet flag. He steps out into the day, the door swings closed behind him, and the city rearranges itself slightly to make room.